Alright, so this is my recording for the shopping app, and this is just starting out. Here is the app on the far right side. This is what I've already preloaded in for the actual app, just on the ones that I've already tested before. So when we actually go and add a new item to the groceries list, let's say we just add the sweets. I'll just title it candy. Say we get 12 of them. We add the item. You can see at the bottom it actually adds in the extra candy piece that you're going to be using. So this is just when it adds in all the different types of groceries that you add in for each one. So looking at the actual code, we have the main.dart file. This is basically just where we call the original file. This is where we just call everything to actually run. This is where I also set the colors of the actual app using the seed color for about a light teal bluish basically, and the surface made blood just a darker blue basically. As well for the scaffold for the background color, I made that a bit of just a darker blue. And for the home, we set for grocery list, which was basically just the title for all the things that we use for actual lists, and we set that as a const here. Now in the category.dart file, this is basically just all the different titles for each of the different items that you could put in the actual grocery list, which for here we use for the enum, then we just titled it categories, and these were all the different type of categories. We had vegetables, fruits, meat, dairy, carbs, sweet, spices, convenience, hygiene, and other, which is just going to be anything that didn't fit into this that you could basically just name anything else that you needed that wasn't covered here. Here we made a class called actual category, and we put as the cons for the title and the color. This was used basically for each of the different categories, giving them their own different color that was already loaded in from the file that I'll get to later. In the grocery list.dart file, this was basically where we had to use I used the HTTP dart package, which I had to import from pub.dev, as well as using the dart convert file library, which had to be for encoding and converting between different representations using JSON, which was again part of the HTTP library that had to be used in this app. So starting out, we actually had the class grocery list, which extended into a stateful widget because it had to actually be mutable, had a mutable state, and had to be changed constantly throughout for the different groceries that were going to be added. And here I created a state and just titled the grocery list state to actually keep track of all the things that would be updating throughout the actual list of the groceries. And here we had made a list for the actual grocery items and set the var till is loading to true, which basically be loading in every time that they had a new grocery item coming in, as well as a string to make it for the error. And here I had a void init state just for the first initialization. So this was where the first initialization was made for the actual grocery list. Here we use the Flutter URL, Flutter Prep 291, which is basically just the project that I made using Firebase, which is where I used to actually store for the shopping list.json, which if you look right here, and you actually go into the database, you can see here, and you click down in the actual shopping list, you can see the actual shopping item that I made. Here we have sweets under the candy and 12 of them. These are all the different shopping items that were made inside the actual app that was stored inside this Firebase database under shopping list. So here we basically are looking through to see if the response code was going to be greater than 400 characters, which is basically like the max amount that I set for it. And if it was greater than this, then we'd set an error code to come out and say that it would fail to fetch the data and to try again later, meaning that it was just too much data, too many great thing to actually be used for that. Going down here, we actually have the print for the final map using a string and dynamic function, as well as using JSON to decode for the response body. Scrolling a bit down, we had the final category for the actual entries for each of the different types of food that you could put in the groceries, or just different categories in general for the different entries you could use. This is where we use the .firstWhere, which is just for the first element that satisfied the actual predicate, which is used, which in this case was the actual items in the actual list data. and that would basically allow the items to be equal inside the value of categories. And going down here, we actually loaded in the items, which would be the ID, which was just the item key, as well as for the name, the quantity, and the category, which is basically what gave you a name, the amount that you would use, so the 12 that I made for the candy, as well as the name that actually gave the name for the string, as well as a certain category that it was under, so candy, milk, dairy, all those different items that you could choose from. Here we did the set state for the actual grocery items, allowing it to equal to loaded items that were basically just the actual items that you chose to actually implement inside your grocery list. Going down into the add item state, you had that sync in through the navigator to actually push the items into the actual page using a material page router. And we had said that if the new item is actually equal to nothing, then it would just return nothing. That's again using the set state to actually add in the new items. The same thing is used for the remove items, just be able to actually take away from the actual list once you want to get rid of them. And I set the child to a text to actually just say no items added when there's no actual groceries that have been actually chosen at that point. Going down, we have the groceries. If the groceries item is not empty, this was basically how it would actually load in all the different names for the ID, the index, the categories, as well as actually changing the quantity to a string, because the integers would be what the quantity actually was. So to actually make it visible into a string, you had to use the .to string. Here we would just return a scaffold using the text, your groceries, which is just to show just a little title that would show you what the actual thing is for your groceries. Now in the new item.dart file, this was basically where you want how to actually add in a new item that was being added. So you have a var for the entered name, the quantity, as well as the category, which basically did three things that you needed: a name, so candy, the quantity, which was 12, and the category, which was just under sweets. Now this is how you save the actual item. Again, you use the URL of the actual Firebase to actually store the actual data, as well as using the header for the content type, and application is under JSON, which is all under that package that was used for the HTTP Dart, as well as the data convert. Here we have the body for the JSON encode, which basically converts the value to a JSON string, which would have been entered name, entered quantity, and selected category. Scrolling a bit down, we actually have the navigator to actually pop off the actual name, the quantity, and the category to actually pop it into the actual Firebase database. Going down, we actually have the widget that I used to actually do that, in which I wrapped in some padding throughout to actually form the actual insets, as well as form it so that it actually was centered into the actual center of the screen, as well as using a validator, which was new to this function, which is new to this app, which basically said that if the value was equal to null, or if it was empty, or if the trim didn't fit a certain length, if it didn't fit between 1 and 50 characters, it would return nothing. And when it did satisfy those conditions, and it would enter that named value into a value, and the exclamation mark was shown to say that it actually would always print that out if it actually did satisfy the conditions. Again, this is just the validator, which I just copied over to actually do for quantity. This first one here is for the name, so that's why it had to be between a certain amount of length for the actual characters. Quantity is also being used there, but this time it's for try parse for the actual values to make sure the values actually fit within that. Here we had the drop down form field for the actual inside the expanded function, inside the expanded widget, I should say. And here I wrapped inside it with a container, being able to actually fit the size box as well as the text for the actual value. This was basically just setting to make sure that the value title actually fit and didn't look too big or too small compared to everything else on the screen. And a bit below, I had a row set using the text button. It was using for the reset as well as adding an extra item. Basically, reset would just wipe it all out, and add item would be to actually add in the new item that you want to add to your grocery list. Moving to the grocery item.dart file, this was basically just where I called the class for grocery item, which required me to do a required this dot, and then for each of the different requirements you needed the ID, the name, the quantity, and the category, as well as this is where I was calling it as a string for the ID, a string for the name, an integer for the quantity, and its own function for category type for the categories. Finally, we have the categories.dart file, which this basically was what was copied over from the actual project. This was basically all the different types of categories that you could choose from. You had vegetables, fruit, meat, dairy, carbs, sweets, spices, convenience, hygiene, and other. They all had their own different name for the strings, which was right here in the orange, as well as the color set for them. And this is basically set as constant because they were going to be used throughout the different things. And that was using all of those to actually get the actual colors to make them all distinguishable from each other. And here is the Flutter course that shows all the different sections of 11 and 12 that have been completed. And that has been everything that was used in the shopping app.